Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're looking at the final months of World War I, when a brand new American army was handed a problem that had stumped the French for 4 long years. This is the story of their first real test, the Battle of Saint-Mihiel. So how does an army really prove itself on the world stage? Well, in September of 1918, that was the question for the American Expeditionary Forces, the AEF. These guys were the newcomers on the Western Front, total rookies. Well-equipped, yeah, but completely untested in this kind of brutal, grinding warfare. They had everything to prove, not just to their allies and their enemies, but really to themselves. But the Americans weren't just charging into any old battlefield. Nope. They were heading for a place called the Saint-Mihiel salient, a stubborn bulge in the German line that had been a festering wound, a real thorn in the side of the French army for 4 agonizing years. See, all the way back in 1914, German forces had grabbed this wedge of French territory, and it was a huge deal strategically because it was basically choking the main rail lines between the key cities of Nancy and Verdun. For 4 years, every attempt to push them out had failed, creating this bloody, miserable stalemate. So what exactly is a salient? Well, think of it like a bulge or a bump in the front line. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, it disrupts the enemy's lines, but on the other, you're sticking your neck out, and that makes you incredibly vulnerable. The enemy can attack you from 3 sides at once, potentially cutting you off and trapping everyone inside. And this particular salient was the site of some of the most ferocious fighting of the entire war. And to give you a feel for just how brutal this place was, listen to this. In 1915, a French sub-officer supposedly screamed "Debout les morts," dead men arise, in the middle of a fight here. That tells you everything you need to know about the desperation and sheer exhaustion of combat in this sector. It was a meat grinder. And this is the hornet's nest the Americans were about to walk into. And then, in September 1918, the Americans arrived. Their commander, General John J. Pershing, had this incredibly bold plan to just erase the salient once and for all. And for Pershing, this was way more than just a battle. It was his chance to prove that the AEF could fight as its own independent, effective army. And Pershing was not messing around. He brought the thunder. He gathered a massive force of over 500,000 Allied personnel, mostly Americans, for this one single operation. It was going to be the first major offensive launched primarily by the U.S. Army in the whole war, and the plan was simple. Use absolutely overwhelming force to just smash this thing flat. Okay, now just look at this table for a second. The numbers here tell a huge part of the story. It's just a total mismatch. The Allies had more than a 3-to-1 advantage in troops, almost a 7-to-1 advantage in aircraft, and all those tanks versus, well, 0 for the Germans. This was industrial warfare on a scale they hadn't seen before. This battle wasn't just a first in terms of scale, it was a first for military lingo too. This was the very first time the American military officially used the terms D-Day for the start day of an operation and H-hour for the specific attack time. Think about that. Terms we totally associate with World War II, they were actually born right here. But Pershing's plan wasn't just about throwing numbers at the problem. It was this really sophisticated, combined arms operation, which just means getting the infantry, tanks, and airplanes to all work together like a well-oiled machine. The goal was a classic pincer movement, attacking from 2 sides at once to trap the Germans inside, like a giant claw closing in. And up in the sky, oh man, this was the biggest air show of the entire war. A guy named Colonel Billy Mitchell, who would later become a huge champion for air power, was in charge. They basically wanted to own the sky, sweep it clear of German planes, bomb supply lines, and be the eyes for the troops down below. Total air superiority. That was the goal. And on the ground, you had the tanks, 419 of them. Now, you got to remember, these things were still pretty new, kind of clunky and unreliable. But the hope was that they could be the battering ram, just punch right through the barbed wire and trenches and clear a path for the infantry. And leading the charge, well, you had guys like this. A young lieutenant colonel named George S. Patton. He was right there at the very front, leading his tank brigade, getting wounded while trying to get his tanks moving and rally infantrymen. It just perfectly captures that aggressive, hands-on style that would make him a legend. So the attack kicks off before dawn on September 12th. And at first, It's an unbelievable success. The American forces are just flying, capturing their objectives hours and hours ahead of schedule. But there was a catch. The reason things were going so well, it wasn't what anyone expected. Okay, so here's the big twist. The plan was to hit this heavily defended German line, right? A solid wall. But the reality? The Americans basically kicked in a door that was already unlocked. See, the Germans knew they couldn't hold the salient anymore. They were already in the middle of a strategic retreat when this massive American hammer came down on them. But just as it looked like a clean, total victory, the oldest enemy on the Western Front showed up: the weather. The rain started, and it did not stop. The entire battlefield just dissolved into this sea of mud, an absolute quagmire. And this is where the new American army learned a really, really tough lesson. The whole advance stalled, not because of German machine guns, but because the supply trucks and the big artillery guns were literally sinking into the mud. You can win the fight, sure, but sustaining that advance, that's a whole other ballgame. It was a logistical nightmare. So, despite all that mud, the salient was captured. That 4-year thorn was finally pulled. But the victory at Saint-Mihiel, it wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. For the American forces, the real mission, the one this whole battle was just getting them ready for, was about to begin. When you look back, it's pretty wild. This problem that had bled the French for 4 years was completely solved in about 4 days. It was a huge tactical victory, with over 15,000 German prisoners captured and a massive boost to Allied morale. But more importantly, it proved the Americans could actually plan and pull off a huge modern battle. And that's really the key takeaway here. Saint-Mihiel was never supposed to be the main event. It was the warm-up act. It was basically a massive live-fire combat rehearsal and a huge confidence builder for the AEF before they were immediately thrown into the biggest and deadliest battle in all of American history, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So in the end, that's the real legacy of Saint-Mihiel. Was it a great victory in its own right, or was it the world's most brutal dress rehearsal? Whatever you call it, it forged an army. It tested leaders like Douglas MacArthur and George Patton, and even a future president, a captain of an artillery battery named Harry Truman. It got them all ready for the even harder fight that was just around the corner.